The 2023 BRICS meeting in Johannesburg, South Africa, saw the official summit declaration announce that the expansion of the grouping would take place from 2024. Described by the Chinese president at the time as an historic expansion, it's hoped that with new members, the BRICS grouping can start to realize BRICS' ambitions of the creation of a more representative, fairer international order, a reinvigorated and reformed multilateral system. So can this group use its economic might to rebalance the global order or even replace it? Well, to get a view on this, I spoke to Dr. Andrew Ross, who's a senior lecturer at the University of Dundee School of Business in Scotland. Dr. Andrew Ross, thanks very much indeed for joining us and welcome.
Peter, thank you very much. Great pleasure to be with you today.
So this BRICS grouping, it's expanding, and one wonders economically, because there are a few dimensions, but let's focus on the economics of it all. How significant is this grouping going to be in future decades?
Peter, thank you very much. As a group of high-growth emerging economies, even before the recent expansion, the group accounted for about 26% of global GDP and just under 41% of its population. From the economic perspective, the new membership will generate about 2.6 trillion in GDP terms, representing an overall BRICS economy of about 28% of global output. Yet, while significant as an economic grouping, by comparison, the G7 countries continue to dominate global output with about 43% of global GDP. However, if forecasts are correct, the size and therefore the importance of the G7 economies will reduce over the coming decades. Equally, at the same time as the G7 reduces, many of the BRICS members, especially the new members, are expected to exhibit very high levels of economic growth by 2050. From a trading perspective, the new BRICS grouping now accounts for about 43% of global oil production, 25% of global exports, and indeed, even without the new expansion, China, India, Brazil, and Egypt this year alone will account for about 59% of all new global middle classes. So ultimately, the BRICS are going to increase in terms of their their economic and geostrategic importance, and that will signify a shifting of the economic center of gravity towards the global south.
All right, so you say a shifting of the economic gravity. So the global south will start to eclipse then the G7 Western nations. Will that have an influence economically on how economics is done in the world generally?
Well, I think obviously many of these are predictions are, of course, forecasts at the moment. And while the G7 continue to dominate global output with over 43% of output, if the forecasts are correct, it is expected that the BRICS will overtake the G7 in terms of GDP terms. Of course, it does remain to be seen, but ultimately this would signify the metaphorical shift in the economic tectonic plates towards the developing world, and ultimately the erosion of the G7 economic power base as we understand it today.
It says clear, and I think everybody accepts that the BRICS also has a political agenda. Do we understand what that might be and what inspired it?
Well, I think, again, that's a great question. And, it's early days yet. But of course, as you say, the BRICS do not limit their ambitions to an economic agenda, but rather they seek to leverage their collective economic weight to pursue a wider political ambition to counteract the existing global order at the moment. Now, that political agenda is wide and varied, but some of the main issues it's looking to address are firstly the issue around geopolitical multipolarity. So the BRICS countries are seeking to promote a multipolar world, one, in their view, where power is more evenly distributed amongst nations, and in particular developing nations. Secondly, the political agenda would be based around greater economic cooperation and development. So that would certainly be at the center of the BRICS agenda. So from the BRICS perspective, they are looking to work together to promote trade, investment, development, and greater infrastructure benefits to the global south, and particularly to the developing countries. And thirdly, on that point, I think much of the BRICS political agenda is about South-to-South cooperation. So you will see these countries prioritizing cooperation amongst the developing countries to share knowledge, expertise, and also resources to address what they would consider to be the common challenges of poverty, inequality, and underdevelopment. But ultimately, by working together, the BRICS countries are seeking to shape a future of global governance that reflects the interests and aspirations of emerging economies.
The last bit of your answer was interesting. Shaping so that the aspirations of developing nations is more in play. To paraphrase President Xi Jinping, he talks about a more representative, fairer international order. How have developing nations been prejudiced then, if fairer is what's required?
Yeah, so I think obviously that's a very interesting statement that you highlight there, which came out of the BRICS Summit in South Africa 2023. Exactly what representative, fairer, and reform translates to for the BRICS, I think is still a little bit unclear at this point, but it is often interpreted to mean that the BRICS will act as a counterweight to Western dominance economically and politically. And you highlighted the idea around prejudices towards the emerging markets, the global south, etc. So some of these allegations around prejudices relate to, firstly, economic exploitation. So many Western-dominated institutions, such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, they have historically imposed economic policies on developing nations that arguably prioritize the interest of Western powers and multinational corporations. Related to that are structural adjustment programs from countries that have sought assistance from, in particular, the International Monetary Fund. And obviously, whenever the International Monetary Fund provides finances, it does expect structural adjustment. But these have often been criticized as imposing austerity, in some instances, unnecessary privatization of essential services, and some have suggested this has led to perpetuating cycles of poverty and underdevelopment. There's also been allegations of trade inequality, whereby the global trade system is often skewed in favor of Western countries with tariffs, subsidies, and trade agreements that disadvantage the developing countries. Obviously, one of the most well-known examples would be the European Union's common agricultural policy. And then I think, generally speaking, just bringing that together, I think, a more fairer international order is one that is likely to challenge the existing political hegemony that the Western powers have historically exerted in the global political and financial institutions.
You mentioned the IMF and the World Bank, and one wonders, is there an alternative that's possible, that's in play, or could even be developed for developing nations?
Yes, again, great question. And some of these, I think, are already in existence. Whether they have the economic and political weight to challenge the likes of the International Monetary Fund is a different matter, but they certainly exist. Firstly, in terms of regional development banks, such as the Asia Development Bank, the African Development Bank, and the Inter-American Development Bank. And these regional banks are very much focused on providing financial assistance and development projects that are focused on the region. And the argument would be that they can focus more on prioritizing localized decision-making and better understanding the needs of their local populations. So that'd be one of the main alternatives that exist at the moment. Secondly, there's going to be, and we see that within the BRICS, there's greater bilateral aid and development assistance between individual countries. And again, the idea here is that they can promote specific packages that are tailored to individual countries rather than the broad brush approach that the International Monetary Fund often has been criticized for. I think finally and thirdly, probably most notably rather in terms of the BRICS, is in order to challenge the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which are institutions that are historically led by Europeans and Americans, the BRICS established the New Development Bank in 2015. And indeed, this was originally set up with authorized capital of $100 billion US. And by the end of 2022, about 33 billion had been assigned to just under 100 infrastructure projects. And that emphasis was very much on upgrading road, bridges, and rail infrastructure. And that was really all about giving this image at the global level from the BRICS perspective around the growth and development can take place on more favorable terms while simultaneously reducing the dependence on the Western-led institutions.
So it's a big story in terms of the economics, and yes, there's a political agenda as well. And we talk about BRICS and now even BRICS Plus, and as a grouping, it's huge. But the reality, though, is there probably is only a couple of superpowers within that. And I just wonder what that means for the order of things to have the Chinas and maybe the Indias of this world in there.
Yeah, so undoubtedly, as we've highlighted already, the collective might of the BRICS is beyond question. However, the group's leverage on the international stage is highly reliant on the 18 trillion US dollar Chinese economy, which accounts for about 63% of the group's economic output. Now, this dependency is potentially problematic for a number of reasons, not least because it makes China disproportionately powerful within the group itself, but interrelated to this point that you've alluded to is the bilateral power dynamic between China and India. So while India has the second largest economy in the BRICS grouping, China's economy is 5 times larger in GDP terms. And while the BRICS may talk about sovereign equality and mutual respect, ultimately money talks. And this gives China greater leverage and scope to implement its worldview and interpretation of any recalibrated global governance system. Now, while China and India agree on the need to rebalance the distribution of global power, reflecting their elevated status, as competing economic powers and geostrategic rivals, China and India are rarely in agreement. There's significantly heightened tensions around ongoing border disputes in the Himalaya region, and India has a complete antipathy towards China's Belt and Road Initiative. So it's unlikely to see consensus to any significant degree between these two countries. Yet, importantly, from the BRICS perspective, if China and India cannot agree a common path, it's difficult to envisage how the wider BRICS grouping will ever achieve their full potential.
All right, so now we've seen recently Russia pushing for Bitcoin as a new payment system for BRICS. And it makes me ask this question about, we've discussed, BRICS's economic power, its geopolitical ambitions. How realistic is it, though, that with all of this potential might, that they can change the global political order or maybe even impose a new one?
Well, I think the expanded BRICS are economically stronger, yet geopolitically weaker. And while they may rebalance the global order, any thoughts of replacing it, I think, are somewhat premature or misguided at this point. Now, I think one of the big issues they have in relation to that point is the eclectic mix of different political, economic, and cultural systems lay bare the difficulties associated with reaching a common ground on any new system of global governance. By contrast, the Western-dominated system that they seek to counteract, while not perfect by any means, is far more homogeneous. It's founded on the well-established rule-based order, and it is without the scale of geopolitical tensions that surround the newly engulfed BRICS. Therefore, again, I think just to re-emphasize that point, they may rebalance the global order, but any thoughts, I think, of replacing it are somewhat premature at this time.
Dr. Andrew Ross, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much indeed for joining us on the BRICS Africa channel.
Great pleasure, Peter. Thank you.